Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. From wherever you are, welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe, and thank you for joining the conversation. We're going to talk today about nuclear power, a carbon-free energy platform that has a controversial, accident-scarred past, and that after the Fukushima Daiichi disaster in 2011, led many nations to pause or completely cancel their nuclear energy programs. Despite its other environmental impacts, including toxic waste that must be stored for centuries or even millennia in facilities designed to protect future generations from the genetic and acute effects of radiation, nuclear power is considered by some influential environmentalists an essential component of the post-fossil fuel economy. For example, James Hansen, the NASA scientist who raised the alarm about global warming in congressional testimony in 1987, is an advocate of expanded use of nuclear energy generation. Our guests today are Jay Jiang Yu, founder, executive chairman, and president of Nano Nuclear Energy Inc, and James Walker, CEO of the company. Nano Nuclear Energy is developing smaller, portable nuclear microreactors that can be moved to where electricity is needed by truck. These microreactors can generate between 1 and 20 megawatts of energy. That's roughly enough energy to power between 400 and 20,000 homes, depending on their needs. And that's plenty for many large manufacturing companies to use in a crisis when other sources of power are down. Nano Nuclear is working on two designs, the Zeus and Odin reactors, and they're designed for slightly different uses. We'll get into that. But what I want to do is preface this conversation by saying that I myself marched against nuclear power in the 1980s and am skeptical of claims that nuclear energy is safe. But the climate crisis requires we consider all options. Nuclear power is certainly safer than generating electricity by burning fossil fuels, which contribute to millions of deaths annually from illness caused by air pollution. However, the mortality statistics for nuclear accidents don't consistently include the long-term impacts to human and other animal health. So it's hard to make an apples-to-apples comparison. So let's get into this vexed and vexing topic to see what light we can shed on how and where and when nuclear power makes sense. You can learn more about Nano Nuclear Energy at nanonuclearenergy.com. Nano Nuclear Energy is all one word, no space, no dash. nanonuclearenergy.com. Welcome to the show, Jay and James. Can you first start off by introducing yourself so people can associate your voice with your identity?
Absolutely. So my name is James Walker. I'm the CEO of Nano Nuclear Energy. Just as a bit of background about myself, I am a nuclear physicist. I have a background with the UK Ministry of Defence, where I used to work in the design and construction of manufacturing facilities to produce nuclear reactors, as well as being seconded to Rolls-Royce for a while, where I worked as a physicist in the design of nuclear reactors for the next generation of nuclear submarines. When nuclear looked like it was on the decline a little bit as an industry, I did move to North America, where I got more involved in capital markets and IPOs of public companies, and that's how I met our founder and our chairman, Jay Yu.
Jay.
Hi, I'm Jay Yu, founder and chairman of Nano Nuclear Energy. My background is in capital markets. I used to work for an investment bank back in the big bank meltdown in 2008. I left and I took my capital and I invested into pre-IPOs and into startup companies. These days, I like to invest in myself and to surround myself with the smartest people in the world, which is where I found my number two, James Walker. Ever since then, he tells me every week, Nano Nuclear Energy is the best time startup he's ever seen in his life. And I'm happy that we placed a big bet on the right sector.
Well, let me ask you about that, because we do know that after Fukushima there was a real pullback. What do you see in terms of the discussion broadening around nuclear?
So it's been very significant change since we started the company, because when we did start, I was cautioning Jay that it was a very sophisticated industry with a lot of history and big players in it, and there wasn't a lot of interest in piling back into nuclear. But there's been a complete sea change. So just take COP28 as an example. There was an announcement that there has been a general agreement by the participant countries to triple the world's nuclear energy by 3 times within the next before 2050. So that will mean enormous increases in nuclear infrastructure, mining uranium, processing facilities, reactors being developed. So that's really all come about within, I would say, the last 3 years. And you're seeing industry put big mandates on itself to reduce its carbon emissions. Effectively, they put zero targets on themselves, and industry has largely come to the conclusion that it's only really possible through nuclear energy. And so even big mining companies have contacted us directly to inquire about the feasibility of launching of, say, a microreactor at remote mining locations, so they could displace their diesel systems, which currently power these things. And you're seeing that not just in the mining industry, but even in the oil and gas industry wants to decarbonize their industries in remote locations, and nuclear will be the way to do that. Maritime companies are looking to replace their bunker fuel with similar reactors that currently power the aircraft carriers and submarines that take the US Navy around the world. So, and even out of government, by bipartisan support on both sides of the aisle, big RFPs and funding opportunities coming out of government now to build back the US's nuclear infrastructure and expand it to larger than where it was before. So we positioned ourselves at exactly the right time when the interest didn't seem to be there. So it's been quite remarkable watching that massive change in sentiment.
Now, your microreactor designs are really, I mean, surprisingly small compared to these massive installations we associate with previous generations of nuclear power plants, which a lot of that was the cooling system. How do your cooling systems work to allow you to put this on a truck bed, for instance, and move it into a mining location?
So the first thing we had to accept is that we weren't the world's best. And so we reached out to who we believe was the premier scientists that would be best at developing these type of technologies. So we brought on 2 technical teams, one out of drawn from professors and scientists out of the University of Berkeley, and another team that we brought on just to hedge our bets out of the University of Cambridge and the professors and scientists there. And we gave them the same MO, is that we want this to be small, modular. It has to fit with an ISO container so we can take advantage of conventional transportation infrastructure like trucks, trains, back of a shipping vessel. And so we can get this anywhere in the world at any time. And we gave them that MO. And they both went away and they came up with 2 different solutions to it. So the Zeus reactor from the University of Berkeley scientists, they settled on the idea that they would just remove the coolant completely, because once the reactor was shrunk down to a certain amount of size, the heat generated was not substantial enough to melt certain materials. So rhodium oxide, certain aluminums. And once you did that, you actually could just thermally conduct for a solid core. And then once the heat was removed to the periphery of that solid core, you could just have a natural circulation of air that removes that heat to a turbine. That is, we believe, probably the most simple reactor you could possibly make. And we're just in the process of patenting that technology now. But that was their solution to it. The University of Cambridge scientists, their solution to this was that they believed that what they wanted to do is having a natural convection system to remove pumps and pressurizers and all that kind of stuff. Their solution was a solar salt with a natural convection pushed by that uranium generated heat. And that also allowed them to reduce the size of the reactor considerably. And that naturally circulating solar salt removed that heat to a turbine system. Odin will be slightly larger just because it still uses that coolant and it's got a few more working parts. But it's also, it can still fit within that ISO container. The parts that are involved are incredibly cheap. And so we expect the capital costs of each of of producing that reactor to be, with economy of scale. It's really going to start to make it competitive with diesel generators in the long term.
So let me try to put a picture to this. What would somebody see and hear if they were standing next to one of your microreactors? It sounds like a rush of air for cooling, but other than that, what are we talking about?
Well, you would just see the ISO container. We don't want to take it out of that. Like the ISO
Right.
container contains the core, the heat exchangers, the turbine, that will all be contained. The idea is that we will move a nano ISO container to the site and put it down there and be responsible for the operation of that reactor. You're not going to hear anything apart from the turbine. That's going to be the only thing you should really hear from us. Mm-hmm. And so the footprint really of this is going to be the ISO container and the security fence we'll just put around it. But the clever part of reducing the costs to the customer is going to likely be the fact that because it needs such little physical input, you could have a couple of people there that are in charge of physical intervention if, I don't know, a tree falls on it or a general level of security. But these things could be remotely operated because they need such little input. So you could have a central location where it monitors the transient behavior of hundreds of different reactors. And that's very likely to be an appealing business model because, one, it reduces the OPEX and the staff costs of these things. It reduces what we could sell the energy for. But it also would mean a lower footprint and that could fit into these remote operations anywhere in the world. So that's what we're aiming to try and achieve.
Now, China recently introduced what's described as the first fourth generation reactor. Are you in the fourth generation, or are we talking yet another generation of innovation in terms of the delivery of Zeus and Odin?
So yes, we would feature within that fourth generation.
Okay.
As well.
So how is the fourth generation markedly different from previous generations? What's changed?
It's it's kind of interesting because in the industry, you don't really use they don't really talk about fourth generation nuclear reactors. Essentially, there's many differences. Like for instance, with a lot of SMRs, they're concentrating on things like HALEU fuel, as an example, which is a more enriched fuel to allow for more compact energy density of the reactor. And there's different design factors that feature into that sort of definition, but effectively, really, it's kind of an amorphous term because they're really targeting sort of better safety, which might be like passive cooling, efficiency and cost, and really they're looking to try and bring down a lot of the capital costs associated with the big nuclear projects, and you can call those the Generation 3 reactors. And a lot of those capital costs that made nuclear seemingly expensive were the fact that with nuclear, all your upfront capital costs is at the front, because you're not refueling like a gas power station where the gas is brought in on a regular basis. But because that capital cost was quite large up front, the financing costs were quite large, and so 70% of the project cost could be financing related costs, and that's going to go away immediately as you bring in these SMRs. And so the efficiency and cost of the next generation, the Generation 4s, are a factor in that definition. But it can refer to all sorts of things. So for some people, when they refer to Generation 3, they're talking about conventional nuclear reactors that use uranium, whereas the Generation 4 might include other designs that are not considered conventional. So high-powered gas reactors, molten salt reactors, the high-temperature reactors, because conventional reactors operate at sort of a lower temperature because they're much larger. So there's lots of factors that feature into that sort of definition.
So you described the reactors as walk-away safe, and as I said during the introduction, I protested against nuclear power, particularly after 3 Mile Island, back in the 80s. So let me ask this question: why is nuclear energy safer today and safe enough to use within a community or on a ship that could, theoretically sink in the ocean?
So nuclear definitely does suffer from a very bad reputation that I don't think is deserved, because what we like to point out sometimes is that if you were to examine, say, deaths per gigawatt hour generated, all the of all the energy systems. And you can include wind and solar or geothermal or hydro in those estimates too. Nuclear comes out in front. It actually beats out wind and solar because the death generated for the power it produces is the lowest of all of those energy systems. And that's orders of magnitude lower than the fossil fuels, as you could probably imagine. So already it's the safest form of energy. Once you start reducing the size of the reactor, it becomes incrementally safer because you are reducing the complexity of the system. As soon as you reduce the complexity of the system, it becomes inherently safer because there are fewer failure mechanisms. Yep. You go to SMR from a big civil power plant, there are fewer modes it can fail. Once you get to a microreactor, that is probably the safest form of energy mankind will possibly come up with because there are very few failure mechanisms. It's already a safe system inherently. And when we talk about walk away safe, that basically means a passive cooling system. So with a big civil power plant, the worst thing that can really go wrong is you get a coolant leak that can lead to overheating and you get a core melt. And then you have a cleanup operation. That's incredibly inconvenient. No one's going to die in that kind of situation, but like it's a Fukushima or 3 Mile incident where nobody dies, but it's very inconvenient. It's messy. With a passive cooling system, you can't get that core melt. So if you say you get even a coolant, even with Odin that uses coolant, say you get that coolant leak, it still will not generate enough heat to melt the core. So you're not going to get that core melt and have that messy cleanup operation. So that's why it's already the safest, but it's going to get safer. And
so one of these reactors couldn't explode, is what I hear you say.
Yeah, I would also like to point out the reactors can't explode. So when you ever see something like, I don't know, a TV version of a nuclear reactor explosion, that was almost certainly either the high-powered steam explosion, but the uranium is not enriched to a point in any civil power reactor or any SMR or microreactor to a point where it could explode. If, say, for instance, if a terrorist wanted to...
Well, I don't mean a nuclear explosion, but I mean that, the steam explosions you're talking about.
Yes. So you could still get a steam explosion with some SMR designs. It's not going to happen with our ones because we don't use that sort of high pressurized steam. That certainly could still happen. But you're not going to... But even if you get that event, that's not going to lead to the worst outcome that you would historically associate with a conventional reactor, which would be once that steam escapes, you're removing the heat removal mechanism, and that will lead to the core overheat, which will lead to the core melt, and then you have to clean up your reactor, and the reactor is effectively defunct at that point.
So, stipulating that this is a lot safer, and it certainly sounds that way. Jay, you put money into this, seeing the opportunity to apply nuclear energy in a variety of new contexts. What are some of the applications you see as new markets for these microreactors?
That's a great question, Mitch. So recently, Microsoft announced they were hiring a lead engineer or innovations person to focus on nuclear energy, in particular, small modular reactors and microreactors. They want to actually focus on creating or implementing data centers off grid. So you talk about the new kind of case studies out there or the future of our microreactors. This is one of these case studies here. Microsoft, one of the biggest tech companies in the world, is already looking into this, perhaps because of cyber attacks. I don't know what their kind of mindset is, but is also probably the clean energy aspect, and also Bitcoin mining companies. A few of them have approached us as well to do partnerships, because obviously with data centers and Bitcoin miners, there's a tremendous amount of heat created. So if you're actually able to bring it off grid to, let's say, Alaska, to have the cooling system for the HVAC, I think these are the reasons why they're looking into clean energy solutions like our Zeus and Odin. But also think about military deployment, remote communities in northern Canada, where a lot of a lot of these communities are run on diesel generators, right?
Yeah.
Fossil fuels. We could essentially replace diesel generators. So that's kind of our use case. James mentioned also, we've spoken to recently, one of the largest mining companies in the world approached us to do a feasibility study in one of the remote mining operations as well. So once again, I mean, Mitch, you're in a remote area now yourself, right? So you understand how, having this kind of independent base load energy that could provide consistent long-term energy that doesn't disrupt your internet, that doesn't disrupt your your TV. That's important to people, and also it's carbon free, right? So we're not emitting all these carbon emissions in the air, and I think that's the key here to kind of looking into the future. Also think of just some of these remote islands, in the Caribbean or in the Philippines or in Southeast Asia. That all these islands are run on, once again, fossil fuels and diesel generators. So we could actually disrupt all these remote islands as well.
So a micro reactor could be the basis of a microgrid that was self-contained and intermittently maybe connected with the grid, but was able to live and operate on its own.
Exactly.
Exactly right. And you're seeing a lot of interest actually come out of a lot of countries with large island communities. So we've already spoken to a big energy company in Thailand. We spoke to some people within the Indonesian government. They have almost all of their islands are run predominantly on diesel, because they have grid connection issues there, and they're trying to look to decarbonize things. But also, these things, to power these things with diesel is incredibly expensive, and so they're looking at solutions, because it's not just the cost of diesel; it's also the logistics and the shipping of this on a daily basis to power an increasing number of homes. It's very polluting, it's very, very damaging for the island ecosystem, and it's just enormously expensive. And they want a solution. And this could really be a game changer for internationally, just replacing a lot of these conventional fossil fuel power systems with a zero carbon emitting energy that does not have these logistical requirements, and uses a far smaller footprint as well.
Okay, I'm really intrigued. I want to take a quick commercial break and come back and talk a little more about these applications and particularly the cost, because it sounds like there's some remarkable equity opportunities here. We'll be right back. Let's return to our discussion with Jay Yu and James Walker of Nano Nuclear Energy. Gentlemen, this is really interesting. And when you talk about, for instance, Indonesian islands using a reactor instead of fossil fuels, that's a really intriguing opportunity to introduce more equitable, no carbon energy all over the planet. How much did these installations cost? And I know you can't characterize that specifically, but can you paint a picture of what a government would be looking at in terms of bringing one of these in to solve the problems you described?
So it's what we probably won't be able to do is give you exact numbers now, but
Sure.
what we can probably explain exactly where we're coming from on this. So from analyzing the business opportunity here, it was apparent to us that the larger market was not to sell the reactor for a start to a potential customer, but to sell the energy over a contract.
Power as a service.
Yeah, it's a power service. And that would, bring in a far bigger customer base, but also make it a far more feasible application to install into these remote locations for a start. The real benefit here is that the economy of scale of mass manufacturing these is going to bring the cost down considerably within the first few years of deployment of these microreactors. So it's like a pharmaceutical drug. The first one costs tens of billions, and every subsequent one after that is pennies or cents. It's going to be the cost of microreactors is going to come down quite considerably. And I mentioned that conventional civil power reactors, they suffered from the problem of that almost the majority of their cost was financing related. But once you once you reduce the size and those capital costs down and that financing cost goes away, again, it becomes cheaper. The ultimate plan here is to make a energy system that competes with diesel generators and creates an energy system that actually beats out things like bunker fuel costs for maritime vessels. And certainly, we're talking about beating out the cost of remote power systems for remote habitation, remote industrial projects, remote mining costs. That cost is expensive. And so ultimately, that's what we're targeting. We believe we can get the reactors to a point where, say, for instance, a big mining project in the middle of nowhere that had to ship in diesel on a daily basis. The nuclear power plants that we would install will ultimately be aiming to beat out those energy costs. So that you would have reduced manpower requirements, reduced logistical costs, but also cheaper energy on site that's zero carbon emitting, and actually much safer for the on-site staff because it still carries health consequences of having enormous diesel power systems powering these remote operations and remote habitation and remote locations.
So Nano Nuclear Energy is a founding member of the U.S. Department of Energy's HALEU consortium. So HALEU, for the folks at home, is high assay low enriched uranium, and that's the efficient fuel that James was talking about earlier. I know that this is not a commercial reality yet. When do we anticipate that kind of fuel will be readily available?
I would say that with HALEU Energy, you've already got a company called Centrus that's licensed to enrich this stuff. It's already produced low levels of this. I think by the end of this year, they will be in a position to produce about 900 kilos of HALEU a year. Now, I don't think that's going to be enough to satisfy the industry completely. And so they're going to be looking to ramp up their operations. But you've got other companies like Orano as well, who have historic practice in the enrichment industries. They will be almost certainly could become involved to supplement that supply that's coming out of from Centrus. So it's already happening. That enrichment process is still building up, but it's going to become much more ramped up in the next 3 or 4 years when other players other than Centrus get involved in that supply chain. So I would say as SMRs become increasingly deployed and online, and we can expect that process within the sort of next 5 years, that production of HALEU fuel will rise to accommodate that. And you'll see massive increase in output in the next 5 years, I would say.
So the question I have about HALEU fuel is, what is the waste that's produced after you've used the HALEU fuel? Is it high-level radioactive waste, the kind of thing that we have associated with nuclear energy in the past, or is it more short-lived intermediate-level nuclear waste?
So the good part here is obviously the waste produced is going to be minimal, and this is just something we like to share so people have an appreciation of how little waste is generated by nuclear. So if you were to take all the nuclear energy that's been generated in the nuclear states from all the power systems, all the big nuclear power plants, and you were to concentrate all of that waste into one area, from decades naval use, civil use, and you were to put that all in one place, it would be less than a football field of waste. Just to give an idea of how little nuclear waste the nuclear energy does generate, and nuclear power systems do generate. From a microreactor, you're looking at a tiny, less than a handful of nuclear waste that will need to go into long-term storage.
Long-term storage, okay.
Long-term storage. But as an example, say for our reactor, what we would do is, once it's ready to be decommissioned, we would go in, we would take out the nuclear fuel. The reactor would sit there for a year, then it would be inert, and it could just be scrapped as normal in a landfill. It would meet the requirements of that.
So the reactor body doesn't become radioactive from the exposure to the radiation, like I understand it.
It minimally does, to a point where you would just leave it in the ground for a year. That year, you could just scrap it as a normal piece of junk metal if you wanted to, or we might just take it back and refit it. But this way we remove the complete. This is the real advantage, I think, of a microreactor, is that you don't have big decommissioning times. We would move in, we would take the fuel out, then you would have a essentially inert, empty vessel. After a year, that could just be scrapped. Then the US, because it is massively ramping up its nuclear infrastructure at the moment, interim storage facilities would just take that very small amount of waste, and it would just store it on our behalf. And there are facilities being set up for that kind of thing. I mean, the good part about nuclear waste, unlike, I don't know, the chemical industry or coal ash, is that effectively it gets less dangerous as time goes on. So it's not like, I don't know, arsenic from a mining operation, which would have a permanent stain on its environment.
I have to say, I've never heard anyone say the good thing about nuclear waste before.
Yes,
but
it is one of the good things, because unfortunately, like, there's a lot of waste produced by the chemical industry or the oil and gas industry, which is permanently dangerous. But nuclear waste, unfortunately, just gets less dangerous over time. And actually, there are technologies that are certainly feasibly possible that can accelerate that process, because all it really is radioactivity is just the breakdown of certain isotopes. And so you can certainly, with laser technology, accelerate that breakdown of those isotopes. And so over time, those technologies will become more sophisticated, and you can accelerate that breakdown. And so that'll factor into, I think, the future of nuclear energy as well.
So two questions come to mind as I listen to what you said. First is, when you talked about the decommissioning process, I want to clarify, can the microreactor be refueled, or are we talking about a single-use reactor for all intents and purposes?
A lot of companies have designed their reactors so that they can be refueled. We're not doing that because it's a better model to take the fuel away and then just replace the reactor itself. So that's actually an easier model than just refueling that reactor. It's easier for us to make the safety case to the regulator that we would replace the entire system rather than the refueling system. And so it has costs and benefits. But the reason why we went for that is that the actual reactor vessel for our microreactors is actually quite cheap. The materials that go into it are not expensive, and so it's actually more feasible just to bring in a reactor and put it down, and then you have 20 more years of a new reactor powering the system. And then
so a 20-year lifespan, that's significant.
Yes, it's a 20-year lifespan that does not need refueling. And then we just obviously remove the waste fuel, and then we scrap the vessel. And if they need it to extend beyond 20 years, we just bring in a secondary system and put that down. So.
Now, since nuclear waste management is still very much a nascent practice, and there's only one nation, Finland, that has a deep geological disposal site to store high-level radiation or waste for the long term, what do we need to do in the U.S. or around the world to make the storage of this material viable at a commercial level?
Yeah, so the interesting part is that this is unfortunately something we know how to do. It's been done before. And there was actually a solution in place. And the US actually spent a lot of money on building up Yucca Mountain.
Yeah.
So there would be a long-term facility. But from talking to politicians when we are in DC, there was a lot of politicking around that. And deals were made that scrapped Yucca Mountain in exchange for certain other things. And the principal reason is that a lot of governors of states don't want to install the long-term facilities because of the bad optics surrounding it. So now you do have interim storage facilities that are being built up in places like Texas that can actually just take this. But I would still think the Yucca Mountain is actually a wonderful solution. Money has already been spent there. If they reinitiated that project, then you would solve all of that long-term storage problems, because it's just material that would sit in concrete, and it would, that is pretty much the whole solution to the issue. I don't know what the political appetite of putting in a long-term facility is in the States, because of the different politicking that can surround that, and the voter base maybe having an unfavorable point of view about a long-term facility being there, even though it's entirely safe, and you're never going to get any sort of.
I think just to back up what James says, I think as PR gets better around nuclear and people are more educated, certain states like that are pro-nuclear, like Wyoming, for instance, because there's a lot of mineral wealth there for uranium. I mean, having a place there wouldn't be out of the picture, I think, because people are accustomed to knowing that, okay, if we build internal kind of waste facility here for the nation, it's going to create jobs. They're educated already; they understand about uranium, but again, many suffer from the bad PR and this kind of image that it's like a bomb that's exploding when that's not even the case. It's almost, it's been given to us as a miracle, and yet we decide to just focus on the bad thing. But humans did create the bad issue here, right? The bad image. But
Yeah.
now we're trying to shift that and create an image where this is going to give us clean energy for the future. The fossil fuels are finite. Wind and solar already proved that it can't supply the baseload energy for the future of humanity. So what is left? Do you want to control climate change? Do you want to control global warming? Well, nuclear is going to be the only way.
Well, we talked about the fact that U.S. is really ramping up its nuclear infrastructure, but when I look at the funding from the government, and particularly in the 2024 Energy and Water Development and Related Agencies Appropriation Act, which is a mouthful, the funding's flat year to year. Is the government making sufficient investment? I know they're backing the HALEU development, for instance, but do we need to do more?
Well, that's their way of actually trying to rebuild their nuclear industry, because what's happened actually is the infrastructure atrophied a little bit because the US became very reliant on imports of Russian enriched material. So, for instance, like there's a RFP at the moment for a deconversion facility. I think that's about 800 million that's been assigned to that. That's all to build back this nuclear infrastructure, because take a company like NuScale. They were the first to get an SMR licensed, but they suffered, their costs suffered considerably because there was not a nuclear infrastructure in place to support them. So
Right.
people criticized them fairly heavily for understating what they believed the cost would be. But it actually was not their fault. If you're doing everything for a first time, it's going to be expensive. But once that nuclear infrastructure is actually in place, and you do have enrichment facilities and deconversion and fuel fabrication and transportation of these things, the costs come down considerably, and then you get a cheap power source. And so the government's strategy here is to build back that infrastructure as quickly as it can. So it's not just that RFP I mentioned for deconversion. There's another one for HALEU too. And there's other big initiatives that are coming out for the principal reason of supporting that infrastructure first. And the government have done funding opportunities for SMRs and microreactors, but they're no way near as significant as the infrastructure projects and the infrastructure funding they're putting in place at the moment.
So from your vantage point, what percentage of U.S. energy generation do you think we can feasibly shift to nuclear to speed the retirement of fossil fuels? And how close are we to being able to really aggressively pursue that goal?
So just as a practical point of view, I think that you will never eliminate fossil fuels completely just because they have so many good downstream products like fertilizers, clothes, plastics, that kind of thing. But in terms of what you're talking about, the energy, there's no reason why you couldn't eliminate it completely from the grid system with nuclear.
When could we do that?
It would certainly, with a ramp up in infrastructure and a uranium supply chain that was sufficient to supply the product. There's no reason why we couldn't do that by 2050 if there was a concerted effort to actually do that. I don't believe in zero fossil fuels completely just because I mentioned that sort of downstream products, but nuclear could easily meet the requirements of the country. It's like there's an abundance of nuclear of uranium and fissile products that go into these reactors, and it's the most dense energy form that we've actually got. It's orders of magnitude more dense, like tens of millions of times more dense than than oil you're getting out of ground in terms of energy density. And we know this works. Like France, I think, is 80% powered by nuclear power currently. There's no and that's given them enormous energy sovereignty and energy security, to the point where they actually export power to countries like Germany that actually downsize its nuclear power to try and move towards other renewables like wind and solar, to effectively increase its own energy costs and make itself dependent on French nuclear power. So it's certainly, we've seen it. It's possible. It would be a very practical solution once the infrastructure was back in place to allow us to do that.
So, Jay, from your perspective as the investor and driving force behind the company, what are the next steps in terms of evolving this industry and doing it in the safe and responsible way we're talking about? Do we need to see a massive influx of capital investment at this time?
Yeah, I think the key here is, we hear this constantly with even the government when we talk to them, is getting public and private, involvement into this, whether it's institutional or retail. We need a collective effort here in order to kind of take nuclear to the next level. And sure, these institutional lenders or banks or investment banks could step in and write big checks, but without the support of retail, it's not going to succeed. It's like all kind of precious metals, right? Like a lot of big players come in, they kind of set up shop, but without kind of the interests of the retail market to kind of drive this on the PR, on social, on TV, then it's not going to work. So it has to be a collective effort, and we do see, obviously, as you know, I don't know if you see the market. Uranium stocks are just surging right now. I think last night even it made it on CNBC on Mad Money with Kramer. Okay, and
that could be a bad sign.
that could. But by the way, there are some people who just short his stuff immediately. Yeah. I understand what you mean by that. But I mean, someone called in and it sounded pretty scripted. They had it all like mapped out, like with all these SMRs, with all this, with uranium stocks going crazy, with this week, the U.S. And the IRA and Biden's initiative to fund $500 million in the next generation of nuclear fuel, of HALEU, right? What do you think, Kramer? So people are now catching wind of this, and kind of, Wall Street is now paying attention. But the issue we faced, and I've seen from inception, is how do we unlock that institutional and Wall Street investment community there? The issue's been, like James mentioned, with these big reactors, it takes a decade and billions of dollars, and there's all this capex that comes in, and it's just, a lot of it is, again, wasted on academic exercise that in the end we don't even know if it's going to work. So we want to de-risk ourselves, and that's why we invested in 2 reactors, not just one. So if we go all in on one reactor and it fails, we still have another one that we have a good idea that it's going to succeed. Then we diversified ourselves to focus on HALEU fuel, and we have the best name, I would think, in America on that. We named our subsidiary HALEU Energy Fuel, just to match the kind of branding there. And we're focusing on the fuel side now, and we're also now focused on the transportation side. So I talked to an analyst recently from an investment bank, and they said, your microreactors are like aliens to me. If you actually succeed and commercialize that, then the market could be enormous, right? It could be $1 trillion, they said. But what I like that you guys are doing, you're de-risking yourselves along the way to the microreactor. You're also filling in the gaps with the fuel, with the HALEU fuel, and the transportation side, and eventually we're going to get into other areas as well. We don't want to disclose too much, but that's the whole viewpoint is we're trying to show Wall Street and kind of the public that we're building a business here, and we're not just building this microreactor that hopefully one day works, but we're building in the meantime other business lines that could become multi-billion dollars in itself, right? So
Mhm.
that's, I think, how you unite public and the private sector. You bring these other forms of revenue generating businesses to the table, and then the ultimate goal is if you hit that if you get it commercialized, your reactors, then that's what changes humanity. That's the structural shift in clean energy.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. My skepticism is tempered.
That's
Never by
great.
anything
Thank you.
completely.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great.
So how can folks follow along with what you're doing?
They could follow us on social media. We've built a cult following on Twitter. Your favorite Elon Musk with Starlinks. So we're heavily focused on Twitter. There's a lot of, I would say educated people there. There's a lot of nuclear engineers on Twitter and obviously uranium investors. So getting that outreach is huge for us. Also, they could come to our website, nanonuclearenergy.com. We're also on a lot of podcasts and radio stations. So you'll see our name out there. I think Zero Hedge did a big article on us that went viral as well. So we're getting our names out there, and we're building this the right way, and we're doing things transparent and open, and sometimes even on Twitter, some of these guys message us with some toxic comments, but we reply to them. We fight back, and we try to help demystify what you said. What James said is it's just had a lot of nuclear energy has a lot of bad PR, and we're here to kind of fight back and educate people.
Well, hey, Jay and James, thank you so much for spending time to talk with us today.
Thank you so much,
No
Mitch.
problem. Thank you very much, Mitch.
That was my conversation with Nano Nuclear Energy's Jay Yu and James Walker. And you can learn more about the company at nanonuclearenergy.com, all one word, no space, no dash, nanonuclearenergy.com. While I remain skeptical, James's explanations are compelling arguments for considering the role of microreactors in a variety of settings that we've discussed here on the show. For instance, ocean freight shipping accounts for 2% of humanity's annual carbon emissions. And if you look at a microreactor, it's about the same size as a diesel engine. So you could easily replace that ship's engine with a nuclear powered reactor that was carbon free. And that's instead of potentially completely transforming the shipping fuel infrastructure from fossil fuels to, say, hydrogen or ammonia-based fuels, which we've talked about on the show in the past. In another context, bringing inexpensive electricity to low-income countries could provide power to run water desalination plants and air conditioners as the planet warms. We need to take care of these people, not just say, hey, take care of your own problems, but actually help bring the low-income world into a modern lifestyle that is sustainable. If we were to do that, we'd also be able to create economic opportunities that have never developed in the fossil fuel era for those nations. When you introduce new energy platforms, there's a chance to reorganize society with greater fairness, and we need to have that conversation. But there's still the question of what to do with spent nuclear fuel. The United States shut down its Yucca Mountain storage project, the only deep geological long-term storage facility in the country, for a variety of reasons, including the well-justified protest by the indigenous communities that live near the site. The Western Shoshone objected to nuclear waste being placed on their treaty lands, and that's their right, and we need to honor it. So if we're going to embrace nuclear to any degree, there's a public debate to have, and a significant investment is necessary to ensure that we safely store radioactive waste for centuries. We'll continue to track this topic for you here on the show, and I hope you stay tuned. I also hope you'll take a moment to share this podcast or any of the more than 450 interviews that we've done on sustainability in your ear. If you take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform, that will help your neighbors find us. Folks, you're the amplifiers that can help us spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, your family, your coworkers that they can find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the fine purveyors of podcast goodness they may prefer. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.